Hi there, welcome to part 3 of the Beginner's Guide to Qualitative Data. My name is Vanlina and I'll be walking you through the skill building section of this training. This recording will include 3 brief lectures on how to develop an interview question for an interview guide, tips on how to conduct a semi-structured interview, and how to analyze the text data. After each mini lecture, there will be an option for you to pause the recording to practice the new skill by working through the worksheets we've attached. The first skill building lecture is on how to develop interview questions. This is part of the developing protocol step of the planning section of our Plan, Do, Act model. So first of all, what is a semi-structured interview? This type of interview is a blend of structured and unstructured and can be conducted with single participants or with groups. You'll have your pre-written questions for the interview, but you can also adapt the conversation to fit issues of interest that emerges at any point during the interview. And this allows the interview to be focused while still allowing respondents' perspectives to emerge or other relevant issues to be brought up and to be explored. This is especially useful if time only allows for one interview per participant. And lastly, for semi-structured interviews, an interview guide can be prepared with some overarching questions and suggested probing questions. But the skilled interviewer is kind of in charge and empowered to dig into details as they arise, while generally touching on those overarching questions. So the guide can be prepared with more or less details as needed. If you would like to learn more about the different types of interviews, we made a methods poster that is dedicated to interviews, and you can find that attached. Remember that an interview question is a stimulus that is aimed at generating a response. The way a question is worded is one of the most important elements in determining how the interviewee will respond to you. So well thought out questions will get thorough answers, whereas shallow questions might result in more shallow answers. So when you're drafting your interview questions, keep the following tips in mind. You'll want to start with your purpose. Any question that you draft should have a clear line to answering your information gap. If you don't have a clear use for the information, don't waste your time asking it. There is a difference between being curious about the answer and thinking it would be nice to know it, versus you need to know the answer to inform your work and to move it forward. This is especially important with qualitative data collection, where you might have limited time to ask these questions. And also, this is a space where you need to consider and reflect on how the question could affect the participant's life, or how it might position you in relation to the participant. So keep in mind, how will you use the data? If you won't be using it, you don't need to waste your resources to collect it. And consider the question, do I really need to know the answer to this, or will it burden the participant? The next thing to keep in mind when drafting an interview guide is determining what you're asking about. The most common types of questions asked are about the following: behaviors or experiences, opinions or beliefs, feelings, knowledge, or background and demographic. To summarize, make sure you determine how you will use the data and what you're asking about while you're forming your interview guide. After you've thought about the key data that you want, it's time to start writing the questions. Here are some guidelines for choosing the words and forming the questions. You'll want to make sure the question applies to the respondent and is age appropriate. Making sure that the questions are audience appropriate will yield the best results for your interviews. We also want to make sure we're asking one question at a time to not overwhelm the participants. You'll want to use simple and familiar words. The question should be easy to understand and digest with no need for clarification. So use as few words as possible to pose the question, but make sure you're using complete sentences with simple sentence structures. The next tip I have for you is to write questions that are truly open-ended in nature. These questions shouldn't be able to have a simple yes or no answer to it. And just as importantly, we want to make sure we're writing neutral questions that are not leading or imposing an assumption. Do not impose anything about the nature, conditions, or quality of the topic, and make sure the question isn't offensive or uncomfortable for the participants. Oftentimes, it's helpful to get another set of eyes on your questions to help confirm the appropriateness of the questions. Now it's time to practice writing the question, but before we get started, I'm going to share an example of an interview question. The question is the customer service good at your favorite restaurant? This question has a few good qualities to it. One, it asks one question at a time, and two, it's easy to digest and the wording is quite simple. And it's likely age appropriate unless we are talking to a much younger audience. Then I would change the wording a little bit. While this question has some good qualities to it, it can be answered with a simple yes or no, so it is not inviting your interviewee to open up. A better way to phrase this question is, describe a time when you received good customer service at your favorite restaurant. This question is open-ended in nature. Now it's time to pause the recording to practice by using worksheet B. The goal of this worksheet is to pick a topic to practice with and draft an interview question and a few probing questions along with it. When you're ready to begin again, go ahead and resume the recording. Now that you've had time to practice how to write an interview question for a guide, I am going to go over in-depth interviewing. This is part of the collecting data part of our plan, do, act model. There is no one right way of interviewing, or is there a single format that is appropriate for all situations. However, there are some guidelines or suggestions that I can provide to help improve your interviews and make it more effective. The first tip is to stay centered on your purpose and let that guide the interviewing process. You don't need to feel married to the guide, so feel free to follow the participant and where the conversation is taking you. And keep in mind that the questions that you've developed are providing a framework for participants to express their own understandings in their own terms. You'll want to use probes and follow-up questions to solicit detail from your interviewee. So some example questions are, can you give me an example of what you mean? Or you can ask, how does this compare to that? When it comes to sequencing your questions, you'll want to start with a broad, open-ended, and non-threatening first question that is easy to answer. This gets the interviewee to be more comfortable with talking to you. You can start by asking these easy questions that are about facts or present status, maybe even a close-ended question, such as, how long have you been working for this school? Then you can move into the deeper questions. Here you can ask about their opinions, about their past or future. You can also include your open-ended questions and probing questions. We encourage you to familiarize yourself with the interview guide. You can refer to it, but being very comfortable and understanding where you want to lead the interview will help you understand what you might want to cut out if you want to dig deeper somewhere else with the interviewee. You'll always want to introduce yourself and the purpose of the interview so that both you and the interviewee are on the same page. During the interview, make sure you're watching your own body language. You want to indicate interest and engagement with the participant and that you're fully paying attention to them. It helps, even though you might be recording or you might have a note taker, it helps to confirm or repeat what you're hearing to clarify a point. The interviewee feels heard, but can also correct your understanding if needed. Lastly, be aware of your own biases and belief systems and how this might affect the interview and the analysis process later on. What you want to try not to do is overloading the participant or interviewee by interrupting them. You want to let them finish their thought before asking more probing questions. You want to try to not offer your own opinions or stories or lead your participant to a desired or preconceived conclusion. If you find yourself losing control of the interview, be sure to use the guide to reel yourself back in if it gets too off track. And lastly, avoid using nonverbal language to elicit certain responses during the interview, such as excessively nodding or rolling your eyes. When you're interviewing, you'll want to listen attentively and respond appropriately to let the person know they are being heard. This is called active listening. You'll want to establish personal rapport and a sense of mutual interest with the interviewee. This applies in virtually every setting. People will not open up to you if they do not trust you or find you welcoming. And just like writing a good interview question, you'll want to maintain neutral towards the specific content of responses. Remember that as an interviewer, you are there to collect information and not to make judgments about that person. You'll want to observe the interviewees while you're interviewing them as well. Be aware of and sensitive to how the person is affected by and responds to different questions. You can tape record when possible to capture the full and exact quotations for analysis and reporting purposes, but keep in mind when sensitive topics are at play, the interviewees might not feel comfortable sharing their full thoughts and experiences if they are being recorded. So sometimes it's best to just have a note taker. You'll want to practice and develop your interviewing skills. This includes being comfortable with silence to allow people the time to process the question and to answer you fully. And lastly, enjoy the interviewing process. Take the time along the way to stop and hear the roses. You'll want to treat the person being interviewed with respect and keep in mind that this is a huge privilege and responsibility to peer into another person's experiences. Now it's time to pause the recording to practice interviewing with Worksheet C. You can go ahead and resume the recording once you are ready to start it again. Now that you've learned how to write an interview question and how to interview, let's look into how we'll analyze the data. This is part of the Analyze and Synthesize Data step of our model. Qualitative analysis is a mixture of science and art. There are key scientific elements to qualitative data analysis, but there are also undefined project endpoints and creative problem-solving skills required that makes it an art form. In between the two, art and science, this is where the magic of understanding our key issues happen, and where we can make the data useful to us. There are a few common qualitative analysis methods, including thematic analysis, content analysis, narrative analysis, and more. We'll be focusing on thematic analysis, which is the study of patterns of meaning. It's about analyzing the themes presented in your data to draw conclusions from it. This type of analysis is great for when you're looking for subjective information, such as a participant's opinion or experience, and it is particularly useful when the data is from interviews or conversations. Thematic analysis comes with a few terms that I'm going to define. First is codes. A code is essentially a label assigned to a piece of text that will summarize the important concept that the text represents within a set of data, such as a transcript from an interview, for example. And a theme is a pattern that repeatedly shows up in the set of data, so codes can be grouped into themes to summarize parts of the data. I've broken thematic analysis down into 6 steps that I will go over in detail over the next following slides. The first step in thematic analysis is to come up with a plan and remember your purpose, priority questions, and your audience. Is this a quick and dirty analysis effort, or is this an in-depth effort? You'll want to plan accordingly based on your need and the level of rigor required. For example, is it an impact evaluation or is it a rapid needs assessment? You'll also want to ask yourself who will do the analysis piece and will it be participatory? Ideally, more than one person is involved in the analysis process. Step 2 is to become familiar with your data. You'll want to review the raw data and read through the transcripts more than once. Qualitative analysis is careful and repeated reading of the text to identify consistent themes. So make sure you're reading the text in full before dividing the text into coded themes. Step 3 of the analysis is to prepare your data. The goal at this point is to convert the messy, raw data into words presented in a format that can be read, edited, checked for accuracy, coded, and analyzed. This may take the form of verbatim transcription from interviews and focus groups, or it could be detailed narratives, or it can be reduced and simplified summaries of these two. Summaries may also be the first step in analysis, even if lengthier data collection, such as full transcripts, are produced. Studies with tight budgets and short timeframes may choose to analyze the summary documents rather than the longer ones. Step 4 is to categorize and organize the information. You may group the information and responses by the questions, but remember that coding is a form of indexing used to organize the massive amount of data produced by qualitative research. A critical step in data analysis is coding label sections of text to describe or interpret key meanings or ideas expressed. Both verbatim or summary format data can be coded, and researchers often do more than one coding pass for each data document. These codes can be developed prior to the analysis, but can also change as the analysis proceeds. Step 5 is to identify patterns and look for themes and explore connections. Now that you've categorized your data by using codes, you'll want to identify the overarching theme. This is where you are going to try to understand the complexity of the data and explore the connections. You'll want to prioritize what has the most substance, and don't fall into the trap of wanting to add a quantitative spin to the qualitative data, such as placing too much emphasis on how many people said this or that. This is also where you'll want to pull out quotes that you'll want to use for later. Step 6 is to make meaning out of the data. This is where you'll interpret the findings and tell the story using data displays. You'll want to keep in mind that the rigor of the analysis depends on the thoroughness of cross-examination. One way to do this is to have regular interaction between more than one analyst to have different points of view when exploring the data and to challenge the conclusions. Now that you have an idea of what thematic analysis is, go ahead and pause and practice Worksheet D, where you'll read through a transcript to identify themes and more. This concludes our qualitative data training. Thanks for tuning into this, and we hope you have a better understanding of what qualitative data is and how you can use it in your work. If you have any questions or comments for us, feel free to email us.